So for 1701, your phenotype and genotype, it is really important that you have gone through the content area up until this point. There's a whole bunch of information about the understanding of genes and alleles and different terminology. Like whether something is dominant, whether it's recessive, whether it's homozygous, whether it's heterozygous. You need to have an understanding of these terms before you get into 1701. So make sure you've watched the video, make sure you've gone through the content area, and then you can kind of start looking at the task for 1701. So when we're looking at sort of genetic research, a lot of times it'll start sort of in Mendel's research. So 3 things, I just want to highlight these before we get into it. So many traits have 2 genes that control it, and some traits are controlled by several genes. Every trait is determined by a pair of genes. So you're going to get a pair, you're going to get one from your mom and you're going to get one from your dad. So each parent gives off one of the 2 alleles. And then what happens is there can be different versions of a gene called an allele. Some alleles may be dominant, which means that basically they mask the expression of the other allele, which is then considered recessive. So for example, if one parent gives an allele for brown eyes, it might mask the other parent who gives the allele for blue eyes, because brown eyes would be dominant, blue eyes would be recessive. So what you're doing, you're going to want to go through these as well. And then you're getting to, in this assignment specifically, you're looking at the phenotype. So phenotype is what you actually see. So I always think of, how do I tell the difference between phenotype and genotype? Phenotype, I think of taking a picture. So if I was to take a picture of Miss Allison, I would see that she has blue eyes. So blue eyes would be her phenotype. If I was to take a picture of my daughter Isabel, you would see her eyes are blue. That would be your phenotype. If you were to take a picture of, a friend of mine, their eyes might be brown, right? So phenotype is what you see, whether you have blonde hair, whether you have red hair, whether you have brown hair, all sorts of characteristics when you just look at somebody. What you don't see, so the difference is you can't see the genotype. So you can't see what both parents have specifically passed down when you just look at somebody. So you can guesstimate you could guess when you know a little bit more. So for example, blue eyes are recessive. So in order for Miss Allison to have blue eyes, she has to have 2 recessive copies of that gene. So I would know that, for example, I could be little b, because I had to get both of the recessive in order for that trait to show. So if you have the 2 alleles that are the same, so for example, little b, then if it's a recessive trait, you know that you had to have 2 of them for it to show up. But genes can also be heterozygous, which means that you get a big B and a little b, and it can kind of change what things look like. So an example here is earlobes. So earlobes that dangle are dominant. We can use a capital letter to show the gene. We can use capital E. So the person, if they're showing this dangling earlobe, they can either be EE, which is homozygous dominant, because both of their parents gave them the dominant trait. Mom gave the dominant trait, dad gave the dominant trait. Or they could actually be big E, little e, because that's still going to show up with the same phenotype, because the big E masks the little e. So you kind of have to know the difference between those two terms, and we'll do a little bit more with this. So the dominant allele hides the expression of the recessive allele, which is why the genotype results in, so why you see that dominant trait. So what have we got here? So attached earlobes are recessive. So similar to what I was saying about you had to have two of the little b's for blue eyes, you'd have to have two of the recessive alleles in order to get an attached earlobe. Because if one parent handed down the dominant trait, you can't get this. So if you see a recessive trait, you know that they have to be homozygous recessive, because any big E, so say mom had given a big E, you wouldn't see this. If dad had given a big E, you wouldn't see this. So it's important to know that homozygous traits that are recessive, are going to be the little letters. And then for dominant traits, you have to think a bit more, because they could be the big E, little e, or they could be two double big E's. So you kind of have to look at it in the big picture to figure out how it is. So let's have a look here. Look at the earlobe and decide what is the phenotype. So for an attached earlobe, you know that it has to be homozygous recessive. Why? Because otherwise you would see the dominant trait. So a free earlobe can be either or. So it can either be heterozygous, because as soon as you get one big E, you will see that trait. Or it could be homozygous dominant, because as soon as you see one of those two big E's, you're going to see that trait. And then an attached earlobe, you know that it has to be homozygous recessive. So we're going to do a little bit more of this as an example once we get to the assignment. So look at each chin and decide. So for this, having a cleft chin is dominant. So see that little cleft here in her chin? It's dominant. So that can show up two ways. One, I wish this would stay up. I want you to look right under where this big C or the big C, little c shows up. So either there can be two different genotypes. Phenotype, I see her cleft chin, so that's the phenotype. Genotype, she either has two of the dominant traits or she has one, because she can't have two recessive or you wouldn't see the cleft chin. So now we've got this guy here. I don't see a cleft chin at all. So I know that he can't have any of the dominant traits. So he has to be little c, because he's got no cleft chin. And over here, same thing, no cleft chin. So she has to have two of the recessive genes. If she had any big genes at all or dominant traits, there would be a cleft in the chin. Okay, so what you are going to do, this will open up. This one is your first assignment. Originally, the assignment didn't have the information that I've given in the pictures, but I think it's just easier, instead of sending you searching all over the place, to give you what I'm looking for and talk about it. So these websites will give you more information about Mendelian patterns of inheritance. So some of the information that I've pulled, or pictures that I've pulled, or traits that I'm going to talk about are explained a little bit more here if you feel like you want to go back and get a little bit more information. But let's look at these human traits. So dominant trait is an unattached earlobe. Recessive trait is the attached. We talked about this. So you would have to have two small letters to get the recessive. You could either have two big dominant traits, so CC, or you could have one dominant and one small trait to get this. Same thing with freckles. If you have freckles, they're the dominant trait. So either both parents gave you a big F, we'll say, or one parent gave you a big F and the other parent gave you a little f. So no freckles has to be 2 of the little f's because it's recessive. If we look at something like a widow's peak, so some people have a widow's peak up on their part, in order for you to actually see that, so for the phenotype to be that I see a widow's peak, either both of my parents gave me the dominant trait, so the big W, mom gave me one, dad gave me the other, or one gave me a big W and one gave me a little w. So that can happen 2 ways. Either mom gave it to me or dad did. And then we look at a straight hairline. We know that this is recessive. So it has to be 2 little W's. If you have a cleft in your chin, that was the other example that we just went through, either your big C, or your big C, little c. In order to have no cleft, you have to be little c. So if we look, there's a bunch of different traits here. So to be bald, let me make sure that I say these right. So just give me a second. So if you're a male and you're bald, so if you're not bald, you have to have the recessive traits from both parents. Oh, poor dudes. That's probably why we see more bald guys than not. If it's dominant, so if you're going to be bald, either both your mom and your dad gave you that trait, so you'd be big B, or you'd be big B, little b. So obviously baldness in male is going to be way more common than the recessive. Same thing, body hair. So the dominant trait is that you have lots of hair. So we'll say, we could call this trait whatever we want to. So we'll call it big B would make us hairy. Big B, little b would make us hairy. And then little b would make us recessive. Okay, so there's a whole bunch of traits here that you can look at. Where else do I have? I think I have a couple more pictures. They might just take a second to load, or I might have to just delete a space. So I'll do that after. These ones are really good too. And it actually gives you an idea. So length of my eyelashes. So if I see long eyelashes, either I'm LL, so both my parents gave it to me, or I'm big L, little l. So this can happen 2 ways. 1, my mom gave me the big L, or 2, my dad gave me the big L. So you have to think about both parents. These hybrids can happen 2 different ways. Mom or dad does it for you. Little L only happens when mom gives you a little L and dad gives you a little L. So lots of different traits here that you can go through. I gave some more here too, like whether you could roll your tongue is dominant. So if you can roll it, then it's dominant. So it could be big T, or big T, little t. And if it's recessive, it's got to be the little trait. So it'd be little t. Okay, so hopefully that kind of makes sense. I'm happy to connect to talk about this as well. But what you're going to do, so for the actual assignment, you're going to pick 10 of these traits. I don't care which ones you pick. I gave you a whole bunch of examples. And you are going to tell me what the trait is. So I'm just going to do widow's peak because it's the closest here. So I'm looking at my own widow's peak. So my phenotype, if you looked at Miss Allison in the mirror, I don't think I have a widow's peak. I'm pretty sure I don't. I'm going to put in no peak. Pretty sure I don't have a widow's peak. And then genotype, what would it be? It's recessive to not have a peak. So I know that I would have to be WW. Okay? Because I have no peak. So my mom gave me a gene that was no peak, and my dad gave me a gene that was no peak. So let's do a different example here. You're going to do this for 10 different traits as you go through. So let's do, Miss Allison, whether I have a cleft. Oh, I want to do something that I have. I have a dimple in my cheek. So I'm going to do cheek dimple. So the phenotype would be that I have a dimple. And then my genotype, because it's dominant, it could either be that my dad gave me the big D and my mom gave me the big D, because that would be dominant, or my dad gave me big D, mom gave little, or my mom gave big D, my dad gave little d. So this actually happens twice when you think about it. Okay, so either mom could do it or dad could do it. And we'll talk about that in Punnett squares in the next example. So I want you to roll through the examples. Probably these ones are going to give you some really good ones. So like say, maybe those ones aren't the best. Yeah, okay. Yeah, they're not bad. Some of these are funny because they're actually giving you blended traits. So if it's something like a blended trait, let's not get into that. I might remove. Kind of like it though. Yeah, just watch if it's something like thick lips, medium lips, thin lips. This is talking about sort of blended traits, which we don't want to get into. Same thing here. We're not doing that yet. Okay, so try to find one that it's either this or it's that. And yeah, so that's it for 1701.